Picture yourself waking up in a world where mirrors have never existed, where you have genuinely never seen your own full face, and where the only reflection you have ever caught of yourself was a blurry, distorted shimmer in a still puddle of rainwater that disappeared the moment the wind moved. You don't know if you're attractive. You don't even have a word for attractive yet. But the 30 or 40 people sleeping and breathing around you, the ones who have known your face far longer than you ever have, they have already decided. Quietly, instinctively, without a single conversation about it. And that silent decision, one that gets remade and reconfirmed every single day, shapes whether you eat well when food is scarce, whether someone chooses you when the season turns cold and survival requires partnership, and whether anyone steps in front of danger on your behalf when danger arrives. That was the reality of beauty 100,000 years ago. And the part that almost nobody talks about is this. Beauty back then had nothing to do with vanity, nothing to do with self-expression, nothing to do with the way we think about attractiveness today. It was one of the most practical, consequential, and quietly brutal things a human being could possess or lack. It was, in the most literal sense, a survival tool. To actually understand ancient beauty standards, you first have to understand just how small and contained ancient human life really was. Because without that context, none of this makes any sense. There were no cities. There were no strangers passing on a busy street whose faces you'd forget by the time you reached the corner. There was no social media, no television, no source of human imagery that wasn't standing directly in front of you in the flesh. The only human faces most prehistoric people ever encountered in their entire lifetimes were the same faces they had been born next to. Maybe 30 people in their group, maybe 50 if they were fortunate enough to belong to a larger band. That was the complete and total universe of human comparison available to them. This means that when ancient humans looked at each other, really looked, they weren't measuring anyone against an ideal they had absorbed from somewhere else, because there was no somewhere else. They were doing something far more primal and far more immediate. They were reading biological signals that bypassed conscious thought entirely and landed straight in the stomach, in the chest, in whatever part of the human body processes the feeling of being drawn to someone before the brain has caught up with a reason why. They were asking, without words and without even realizing they were asking, whether the person in front of them looked like someone who was going to survive the next season, and whether the children they might produce together would survive too. That single, wordless question was the entire beauty standard. Everything that ancient humans found attractive, in both men and women, was ultimately just the surface of that one desperate, underlying need. What made women beautiful? For women, the physical signals that ancient men responded to had almost nothing in common with what modern culture tells us is attractive. And yet the moment you understand the world these people were living in, every single one of those signals makes complete and immediate sense. Wide hips, for example, were not a body trend or a cultural fashion that came and went. They were direct biological evidence that a woman's body was built to survive childbirth, and childbirth in the ancient world was one of the most reliably lethal experiences a human being could go through. Women died in childbirth with a regularity that people today find genuinely difficult to imagine. A woman whose body showed the physical signs of being built to survive that process was not just attractive. She was precious in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with the cold arithmetic of who would still be alive next year. Clear, smooth, unblemished skin communicated the absence of infection, active disease, and parasites, all of which were constant and deadly threats in a world with no medicine, no sanitation, and no understanding of how illness actually spread. Full lips and clear, bright eyes signaled youth, and youth meant reproductive years still ahead, which, in a world where life expectancy was brutally short, was genuinely valuable information encoded directly into someone's face. A symmetrical face, one where both sides matched cleanly, was the body's way of advertising that it had developed through childhood without serious illness, without significant nutritional deprivation, without the kind of developmental stress that left permanent, readable marks. Symmetry was the face saying, quietly and without words, that this person's immune system had already done its job well. None of this was a conscious calculation. No ancient man was sitting with his back against a rock actually thinking through developmental biology and reproductive fitness. He simply felt pulled towards certain women and couldn't have articulated why if his life depended on it. Which is, when you really think about it, almost exactly how attraction works today. The feeling was identical across 100,000 years. Only the naked survival logic underneath it was easier to see when there was nothing else layered on. So, what made men handsome? For men, the standard inverted almost entirely, because what women needed from a male partner was a completely different set of guarantees. And those guarantees had to be readable from the outside, visible, without a single word being exchanged, because there was no other way to gather that information quickly enough for it to be useful. Women in ancient times were not looking for pretty features or a delicate face. They were looking for physical evidence of capability, tangible, visible proof that this particular man could do the things that staying alive in a hostile world required. Broad shoulders communicated the ability to carry, to hunt effectively, to fight when fighting became unavoidable. A strong jaw and a pronounced brow ridge were external markers of high testosterone, which in a body built for the ancient world meant greater muscle mass, faster recovery from physical exertion, and the particular kind of aggression that kept a group safe when something tried to take what belonged to them. Height communicated reach, visibility across an open landscape, and a natural dominance in close physical confrontation that shorter men simply couldn't match. But the detail that genuinely surprises most people, the one that says something real about how differently ancient humans read the world, is that scarring was considered attractive. Not in spite of being an imperfection, not as some quirky exception to the rule, but specifically and directly because of what a scar communicated to everyone who saw it. A scar meant this man had already walked into something dangerous, something that left a permanent mark on his body, and he had come out the other side of it alive and functional. That was not a flaw in ancient eyes. That was a resume. Calloused hands, a body shaped visibly by years of sustained physical work, the lean and particular kind of hardness that comes from actual exertion rather than deprivation. All of it read as accumulated evidence that this man had been tested by real life, repeatedly, and had not been broken by any of it. That was what beauty meant for an ancient man. Not softness, not symmetry, not prettiness. Proof. The consequences nobody mentions. Here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, and also where most people's history education quietly decided to stop. Being considered unattractive in a prehistoric group was not a social inconvenience. It was not the ancient equivalent of being unpopular or left out of certain conversations. It carried material consequences that touched every single aspect of daily survival. Resources flowed toward the people who were perceived as most valuable to the group's collective chances. Mates selected the healthiest and most capable options available to them within their limited pool of choices. Someone who was consistently overlooked, for whatever reason, whether physical or circumstantial, or simply a matter of being compared unfavorably to someone else in the same group, received less of everything that mattered. Less food during the seasons when food ran short. Less active protection when the situation turned dangerous. Less partnership in all the ways that partnership was the difference between making it through the winter and not. This was not cruelty the way we understand cruelty today. It was not a decision that anyone sat down and made with conscious intention to harm. It was a group of frightened human beings, doing their best to survive conditions that were genuinely trying to kill them, making fast and instinctive and largely unconscious judgments about where to direct their limited energy and loyalty. But for the person living on the receiving end of those judgments, the experience was total and consuming. It shaped every waking hour of their existence in ways that had absolutely nothing to do with how they felt when they caught their own reflection in the water. The twist that changes everything. And then archaeology does something that quietly and completely complicates everything we just established. Researchers keep uncovering burial sites. Ancient ones, some stretching back 60 and 70,000 years, where people were laid to rest with unmistakable care. Bodies positioned deliberately. Objects placed beside them with apparent intention. The arrangement of bones suggesting, to the researchers who spend their careers learning to read these things, that the people doing the burying were not simply disposing of a body. They were grieving one. And some of those bodies, when their skeletons are examined with the full toolkit of modern forensic analysis, show evidence of lifelong physical conditions, congenital disabilities, chronic illnesses, degenerative diseases, that would have made the person completely dependent on the active, ongoing care of the people around them for years. In some cases, for what appears to have been their entire adult lives. Someone carried those people through terrain that was difficult even for the able-bodied. Someone fed them during seasons when there was barely enough food for the people who could contribute to finding it. Someone made the decision, over and over again, across months and years, that this particular human being was worth the very real and very costly investment of keeping alive. In a world that had no framework for charity, no religious institution asking it of them, no social expectation that they do anything of the sort. Which means that even in the most extreme survival conditions human beings have ever lived through, worth was never purely a physical calculation. Something else existed alongside the cold logic of attractiveness and fitness and capability. Something that looked after the people who couldn't look after themselves. Something feet left flowers or tools or red ochre in the dirt beside the dead. Something that, for the complete absence of a better word, loved. So what did ancient humans actually find beautiful? Bodies that looked built to survive. Faces that showed no sign of having been broken by disease or developmental stress. Strength and visible capability that communicated, without a single word, that this person could protect the people standing next to them. All of that was absolutely real, and all of it mattered enormously in a world where the margin between living and dying was thinner than most of us will ever have to understand personally. But those burial sites keep pulling at something that the survival math alone cannot explain. Because buried carefully and deliberately in the same ground as the strongest hunters and the most fertile women and the most capable fighters were people who had needed help getting through every single ordinary day of their lives, and someone had given it to them anyway. Not because a law required it, not because a god demanded it, apparently just because they couldn't bring themselves not to. Ancient beauty standards were brutal in ways that are genuinely uncomfortable to sit with, honestly. And running right alongside that brutality, visible in the same soil and the same bones and the same careful arrangements of stone and flower and bone, was something that looked startlingly, unmistakably, and completely human. The quiet and costly decision that certain people were simply worth the trouble of loving, regardless of what they could offer in return. Some things, it turns out, are so deeply wired into what we are that 100,000 years of everything changing could not touch them at all.